Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Maxon booth here at NAB 2019. I'm Matthias, aka Major VFX, and I'm accompanied by amazing artists from around the world showcasing how they use Cinema 4D in their workflow to create everything from movies, VFX, medical illustration, animation, games, you name it, used across the board. One of the big things for everybody who's tuning in, and if you haven't been made aware, or if there isn't any signage anywhere, Redshift is now part of the Maxon family, so we're so happy to have them on board, and it's thanks to the community. You guys have been a big supporters for a long time, and now we're all one big happy family. So that's big news. Also, we're up for Product of the Year here at NAB, and we got an Oscar this year for MoGraph, and that's once again thanks to the community and everything that you guys are doing. And it warms my heart, because I've been here for like 10 years to see us now getting an actual Oscar and everything else. So thank you for all the amazing motion work that you guys are doing, everybody here and online and at home. So to that, we have another amazing artist. To my left is amazing motion designer as well as art director, Bryan Coleman. Let's give him a big round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Bryan Coleman. I'm a freelance motion graphics designer, style frame artist, art director based out of Los Angeles. A lot of my work is broadcast and commercial design work. I work with After Effects, X-Particles, Octane, Arnold, Redshift, but the primary foundation of all of my work is C4D. It's where everything starts. So I would like to thank Maxon for bringing me out today to talk to you here at NAB. Thank you guys all for coming too. I'd like to thank everybody who's watching live. I think I might have some friends, maybe some family. I'd like to give a special thanks to my wife, who has been a good support crew for this presentation, and my friends Robin Haddow and Toros Kose. If you're watching, thank you both for all of the help. A lot of my work is data visualization, but I also do a lot of realistic rendering and lighting, all within cinema. A lot of the work that I'll be showing today was created using X-Particles and rendered with Arnold, but I'm going to show you how to do everything directly within cinema. So I hope when you leave here today, you have a better understanding of how I use C4D, and also have a better understanding of how to simplify your workflow within cinema for motion design. So let's take a look at my demo reel, and you guys can see what I do. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So I have 3 projects I'm going to talk about today. Let's jump in. First project I worked on was with a buddy of mine, creative director Toros Kose. It was for HPE. It was for Green Lake, which was going to be a conference based out of Madrid, Spain. So what I was creating was this backdrop that would be this slow-moving, undulating body of water made out of data. And then that would run behind speakers talking about data security. So let's take a look at that project, and I'm going to show you how to build some of it. All right, so let's take a look at how to build this. I'm going to focus on this shot right here, this slow camera move rotating around this object, these splines, these data lines, these data bits. Let's get into the project. We're going to start from scratch. I'm going to go to my top-down view, and I'm going to grab the polygon pen tool. I'm just going to draw a straight line. It doesn't have to be too perfect. With the spline selected, I'm going to go Option, MoGraph, and Cloner. So now my spline is a child of the cloner. I am a huge fan of staying organized in Cinema. I name practically everything, and I put practically everything into a layer. And some people are like, why do you have 26 layers? Because it helps me stay organized. So it's a very simple thing to do, but I recommend using it. And I'll get into the layer structure and system here once I build everything, just so you can get a better understanding of that. Under the attributes, let's change the mode to, let's change the mode here to endpoint, and I'm going to take this down to 0. I'm going to increase the count to, let's crank it up. I don't know. Let's go 80. I'm going to make it change on the x-axis about 2,000 units. So now we're starting to get this very nice broad scope of splines. I'm going to grab my scale tool, make sure I'm in object mode, and let's just scale those splines up. So I'm going to create this squarish shape, something like that. That seems pretty good. Just kind of working on the fly here. I'm going to grab this guy, and I'm going to go Select Children and Objects, Connect Objects, plus Delete. So now we just have this one object, this one spline that is this whole thing, so let's grab that. You'll notice that when I collapsed it, that the axis is now off center, and I always like to work in the center. Sometimes you might work with other people's projects and you wonder why everything is sort of off in the distance and it doesn't make any sense. So from the foundation, let's just zero everything out. The next thing I'm going to do is add a deformer to this. So again, let's click on the lake, and I'm going to go to Displacer, and now our displacer is a child of our lake. One thing you'll also notice that a lot of my work tends to be splines and data bits like that. But if you do not have your spline selected, it's black. So one really quick, easy solution just to see it while you're working is to go to Basic, Use Color. We'll turn that on, and I am going to make that green just because it seems and feels right. Seems pretty good. I'm going to go to Displacer now, and under Object, Object Height, I'm gonna scrub that up and down. You can see nothing is really happening. We need to tell it. We need something to drive the deformation. So let's go to Shading. I'll make this very simple. Go to Noise, and we can see that something is happening, but it's not quite doing what we want. And the reason that is happening is because we need to select our spline object, change the type to Bezier, and intermediate points to natural. And over time, I just have always found that the number 65 has worked very well. We can start to see that something else is starting to happen here. This is looking pretty good so far. Under the noise, let's change the global scale to 3,000. Wow, look at that. Starting to get some cool stuff. So we're getting these really nice fluid movements across here. Things are looking pretty good. Let's adjust our animation speed because we want this to animate. So if I just do a quick play, we can see that we're starting to get this nice undulating motion. It's probably going just a touch too fast. Our clients want it to move very, very slowly. Let's just stick with 0.5. That seems to work pretty well. One other thing that you're going to notice is that this is only working on one axis right now. So I want to make a few adjustments to this because I always like to separate things out. I'm going to do this as an XYZ displacement. That way I can adjust the height of it. So maybe it's not too much. Maybe the X is a little bit louder. And the Z, I don't really want it to fold over onto itself with Z too much. So let's make that X. And under Object, let's change the direction to planar, and by default the orientation is set to X. I'm going to duplicate this by command dragging, make sure it's a child, and let's type Y here, and I will change this orientation to Y plus, and let's do that one more time. I'll call that Z, change this to Z plus, and let's go back into our Y, and let's take this down to about 100. starting to work pretty well. Maybe let's take this down just a touch further, 65. Seems to be working pretty well. So I do a lot of my work in Arnold, and with Arnold, you could just grab a Arnold texture tag, Arnold object tag, drag it on top, and you can render those splines. But Cinema makes it very easy as well. So let's go to Create Shader and Hair Material. Let's just drag and drop that onto our lake. So a lot of my work is rendered white or semi-transparent white, and then I render that on black, no alpha. That way, when I take it into After Effects or compositing program, you can start to layer it up, and you can use some of the simple tools within After Effects to add color to it. Andrew Kramer has Vibrance, I think, VC Vibrance. So I use that a lot. So I'm going to render this all white, on black, no alpha, and I'll show you how to do that with the hair material. So the hair material tag, let's go to basic. We're going to turn the specular off under color. I don't need this ramp, so I'm going to remove one of those knots. Double click the right knot, and we're going to make that white. Under thickness, I'm going to change the root and the tip to be 0.4. I'll do a quick render here, and we're starting to get somewhere. So we're starting to get those nice white lines, some overlapping. You can kind of see we're getting some highlights here. Some of this other stuff is not quite as bright, so when you start to layer it up, you get these nice little glints that are happening on the surface. Another thing I like to do is you'll notice that these are all the same size. So one thing I like to do in my work is to make it somewhat more organic, and I'm going to attach a noise shader to the thickness of that spline, and just so you can see what's really happening, I'm going to adjust the contrast. Click render one more time. You can see it starts to just break that up a little bit. So again, in compositing, you'll start to get some nice highlights here and there. It just feels very natural and organic. The next thing I want to do here is I want to make these little data bits that are rolling across the surface. So let's do that. I'm going to create a new sphere, make sure it's its own thing. Let's change the radius to 2 for now, just so it's not too small. With that selected, let's click Option on a Mac cloner. Now it's a child. I'm going to call this Data. Under Mode for that cloner, let's go Object, and I'm going to drag the lake in there. So now we're starting to generate those clones on the surface of those splines. Let's increase the number to 30. You can see that they're all evenly spaced, though. So let's just make a couple of quick adjustments. Under Offset, change that to 50%, and Offset Variation, let's make that 50% as well. So now you're starting to get some variation in the placement, and I want these guys to animate, so let's change the rate to 1%, and I'll just change the rate variation to 2%. Let's go back to the beginning, click play, and we're starting to get this nice wavy motion. We can see that our data bits are slowly moving across the surface. Some of them are leaving. So that's working exactly how we want. If I zoom in here, I want to show you something, though, that I don't want. I'm going to click render. By default, the shader on this, we're getting default light, so we're actually getting some shading and some reflection or specular on these clones, and we don't want that. Again, flat white or semi-transparent on black. So let's create a new material, and we're going to drag that onto the data. Let's double-click the material tag. Under Basic, I'm going to turn off color, turn off reflectance, turn on luminance, and turn on transparency. And I want to make these semi-transparent just so that you can see through them a little bit. See how that's working. You can start to see through that. That's pretty good. So again, when I start to really composite it together, this is all going to come out. The other thing I want to do is I want to change the size of these to be a bit more random. So with that selected, the data, let's go to MoGraph, Effector, and Random. By default, it adjusts the position parameter, but I want to adjust the scale. And I always want to make all of these even. So let's go scale minus 0.4. Let's throw something like that at it. So now we're starting to get some variation in the size, the scale, the movement of these guys is all happening a little bit differently. I'll click render here so we can take a look at what's going on. So that's starting to work pretty well. You could definitely make a few adjustments on maybe adding some more clones that are smaller, maybe just a couple that are bigger, just to get that nice depth that you have going on. You might even add a few more of these splines in here, just smaller, maybe 1 or 2 bigger, just to get that variation. So now we are going to, in our perspective view, just zoom in so that that object that we just created, our data lake is filling up the entire screen. In my perspective view, I'll click on camera, and now it generates a camera in the exact position that our perspective view was in. I'm going to make sure that I am in and using that camera in this mode, and I will create a new null, and I'm going to make the camera a child of that null, and I will go to frame 90, and I'll set a couple of keyframes here. I'm going to set a keyframe on all these rotation attributes. Go back to the very beginning, and I will just rotate this around a little bit. 28, 30, that seems good. Let's click to set a keyframe there. And I will click play, and you're going to see something that I don't really want. If you look at that animation that I showed you, it's 5 shots strung together. So we want everything to be a very consistent speed from start to finish. We don't want any jolts in it. We don't want any slow starts, slow ends in any of the shots. So I'm going to hit Shift F3, and I will come into my F-curve mode, right-click, click linear, and now we have a very slow move, nice rotation, click render. All right, let's take this into After Effects, and I'll show you how to composite this very quickly. I'm going to use Tint, which is a color correction directly within After Effects. And you'll see exactly why I like to render white on black. And I'm going to change that color just to be, let's go up here. That seems pretty good. I'm going to duplicate that layer, and I'm going to add it on top of itself. Let's solo it out. And I am going to grab my levels and color correction. Let's make it be on top of the tint. Let's crush these levels down. Now we're just starting to get those bits of data in there, and you're starting to get sort of that highlight that I was mentioning when we added the noise to the thickness of things. So that's looking pretty cool. I'm going to unsolo this, and now you can start to see that we're getting these little data bits on here that are starting to get the highlights. You could add glows, layer it up even more, just really fine-tune it to get that look that we're going for. One thing I do want to point out really quickly here, I want to show you how to work with this layer system because I use it quite a bit. So I'm going to call this lake, double-click, call this lake. I'm going to command drag that onto my lake, and it drags the parent and the child into that structure, into that layer. I'll call this one data, and command drag that onto the data. One cool thing that I like to do here is a lot of times I'm just turning the visibility of some of my objects off. Sometimes I want the objects to be on, but I don't want them to render. Do a quick little preview. So now my lake is not rendering, my lines are not rendering, only the data bits are. Perhaps your scene has 50 objects in it and you don't really want to see them all. You could remove some of those objects from the object manager. You could lock that layer so that you don't ever accidentally move it around and scratch your head later on trying to figure out what's going on. You can turn off the MoGraph capability. So this happened to me yesterday, and I'm not sure why. Oh, because I'm using the wrong layer. See, that's classic. That's a classic move right there. So you could turn off the MoGraph capability. So a lot of times if you have too many clones in the scene, it's just really bogging your system down. You still want to see some things, but you can turn the MoGraph capabilities of that off. And under Lake, I have all those displacers in there. You can turn that on and off so that now we are not seeing any of the displacement happening. So let's take a look one more time at that piece. All right, we're going to get into some really detailed stuff now. That was the simple stuff. Now it's going to get serious. Everybody hang on. Next project I'm going to talk about is a project I worked on with Big Block out of Los Angeles for their client, the golf company TaylorMade. They were coming out with a new line of clubs. So they had some features they were trying to highlight. and so they wanted this holographic look that would be overlaid onto the footage. So we were given the footage by TaylorMade, and we had to take that footage, we had to get it tracked, we had to get the camera put into a scene. We also had the geometry from TaylorMade that then needed to get placed into the scene. So our trackers sent that back to us with the camera and the footage, and I'm going to show you what that looks like, and then we'll dive in and talk about how we actually did it.
The new M2 irons feature M's distance and height, now with face slots, which means you'll not only reach the green, you'll stay there.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about two things in this project. I'm going to talk about how to make this fluted hosel, and I'm going to talk about how to make this shape exist around the outside of the geometry. You can see that it's just got some little bits of highlights on it, just some lines that are just sort of hitting the edge of this geometry of the club. It's just a little bit larger than the outside, and to the client this was showing us that it was a lower center of gravity. So all of these bits and pieces took months to create. So I'm showing you the finished project, and I'm going to show you how we got there, even though my mind was shredded day after day of making this. So let's make something cool. I'm going to open up that project. I've taken the liberty of breaking it down a little bit already. So here's our camera and our club. It's already in the scene, looking pretty good. Our camera rotates around. It's simplified just a little bit. So let's go into our perspective mode, and we can see that we now have that camera. We've got our club. So let's break it down a little bit, because I don't really need to see everything. I'm going to turn off the handle, I'm going to turn off the shaft, and I'm going to turn off that camera. I'm going to zoom in here. So we're talking about these little guys, these little hosels right here. I don't really know what they do, but we just want to make them pretty. That's the bottom line. So we're going to click on our club head. I'm going to click on the polygon mode, and I'll grab my selection tool, and I'll start to drag around in here, and we're starting to select these guys. That would take forever. You may not even get all the selections that you want. So one very quick, easy solution for this is to go to Select and Loop Selection. Once I put that onto my geometry, we can see that Cinema is already trying to create a loop out of all of those edges. And I'm going to zoom in here and click once, and we can see that it has created an edge around the outside of that hosel. And I'll show you what I'm going to do with that momentarily. With Shift selected, held down, I'm just going around and selecting all these guys to select every single one of them. And the other thing I'm going to do here is another very simple technique, very simple tool that Cinema has given us. Go to Select, and I'll use the Fill selection. You can see by the icon here that it's actually an edge with a little arrow that goes to a polygon. So let's grab that tool, bring it inside here to our viewport, and you can see that it's highlighting these polygons. Let's click once, and now those polygons are selected. With Shift, I'm going to hit Enter twice and go back into my edge mode. With Shift, I'll select one more time, and we'll do that all the way around. We're just going to select all these bits of geometry. Make sure Shift is selected, held down every time you do this. Okay. Got all these guys selected. Cool. So let's pull this out of that geometry. We're going to go to Mesh, Commands, and Split. Now we have this piece of geometry, which I'm going to call the hosel. And if I go to my object mode and just move it around a little bit, you can see it's its own piece. It's its own element. The original geometry stays in place, and now we have that new object. The problem, though, is by doing that, our geometry thinks that its axis center is over here. So let's go to Mesh, Axis Center, Center Axis 2. And now that axis is directly in the center of that geometry, but the other problem that we've run into is that it doesn't recognize that our geometry is twisted. It just thinks that it's a normal piece of geometry straight up and down. So let's tell it what to do. I'm going to go to my front view, and I'll enable axis, or you could just hit L. I'm going to rotate this axis around, and I'm going to tell Cinema that this is your new axis, this is your new home. Doesn't have to be too accurate. This is a very fast movement, but that seems right. So now I'm going to click off of that, or click L, and I'm going to scale this up a bit. So let's scale this up, And we're going to scale that part back down. So now it looks like it's just this highlight of this hosel. So that's looking pretty cool. The other thing I like to do is I always like to create a null and then animate that null as opposed to animate the object, because if you get down the line, clients made changes, you end up running into a lot of problems because you animated an object, not a null. So let's just fix this. I'm going to grab a hosel and I'm going to create a new null, and my hosel is now a child of that null. And it has also retained that information that I just gave it to the regular hosel, so my axis is turned and tilted and rotated around. And if I just do a little rotation here, that's working pretty well. I'm going to go to frame 40, and I'm going to set a keyframe on the rotation for that null. Go to frame 0, and let's just rotate this 53 degrees. Seems good. Set some keyframes there, and I'll just scrub through this. We're getting a wobble. That's not cool. We need to fix that. Very easy to do. Let's undo our keyframes. With our null selected, go to freeze transformations, and we're going to freeze rotation, freeze position, and it zeroed all of these things out. So once again, let's go to frame 40. And we'll set some keyframes at frame 40, go to frame 0, and we'll just rotate this again, 57 degrees. That seems fine. You'll notice that it's only rotating one axis this time. And if I just scrub through this, we're starting to get that nice rotation around there. This all happens really quickly, so it doesn't have to be too perfect, but this is looking pretty good. So let's talk about how to render this out. So I'm going to create a new material, drag and drop that onto the hosel itself. I'll double click that material texture tag, and under basic, turn off the color, turn off the reflectance, turn on luminance, turn on the transparency, and we're going to make this semi-transparent. We just want to see through it a little bit. Let's just click render. I want to see what that looks like. See, this is when you have to make sure it's on its own layer. So let's create a new layer, add it to its own layer, and click render one more time. And that's still not rendering because, of course, I didn't drag it into the layer. So, classic moves. So now we can see that our luminant material is making a nice white area here for the hosel. We can see through it just a little bit. One problem you'll notice, though, is that we can actually see through to the backside of this. So to make it more realistic, we need to make the club a matte. So there's a few ways you could do this. You could use the object buffers. You could do a few other things. One way that I work, just very quickly, is I like to create an entire object and attach a new material to it and make it a matte. So I'm going to duplicate this entire structure. And I am going to go to Edit, select Children, Objects, and Connect Objects plus Delete. Let's call this Blackout. Excuse me, I need to back up. I need to remove a couple things. Undo, undo, undo. Take this out, take the shaft and handle out. I only need the club, so let's go to the iron again. Select Children, Objects, Connect Objects plus Delete, and let's rename this. I'm going to rename this Blackout, and I'll tell you why here momentarily. Let's copy that name. Double-click to create a new layer. Paste that name in there. Drag it on top of our object, and now it's in its own layer. Let's turn off the other two things here. I don't need the original stuff. I'm going to create a new material. Drag that onto the blackout. Go to my attributes, double click that. Make sure that the color is black and turn off the reflectance. And let's click render one more time. And now we're starting to get that matte on the back side. We don't see it anymore. So then when we start to composite this together, it's all going to look really pretty. The other thing I want to do here is I'm going to turn the transparency of this entire structure down in After Effects, but I want to retain an edge highlight. So let's go to my hosel. I'm going to go to my edge mode, and you can see that Cinema has retained that information that we had selected these edges already. So let's go to Mesh, Command, and Edge to Spline. So now this has created a spline on those edges that were those edges originally. And let's go to Create. We're going to create a new hair material. And let's drag and drop that onto the hosel spline. Double click. And under the color, let's turn off the specular. Under color, let's remove one of these knots. We're going to make this white. Drag that over. Under thickness, let's make this 0.4. That just seems like a good number right now. And I'll zoom in a little bit, click render. And we can see that we're starting to get these edge highlights, but you can see that it's just a little jagged, and there's a quick fix for that. So let's go into the hosel spline object type, set to Bezier, and intermediate point set to natural. And again, I like the number 65 on this for some reason. Click render. And now we have a very smooth edge, and the interior of the hosel is looking pretty good. Cool. So the next thing I want to focus on is, well, one, let's select the right thing. And we're going to create this shell that goes around the outside. So very simple, easy solution to this. I'm going to duplicate this blackout. I'm going to call this guy inflate, and you'll see why very soon. I'm going to add this to a new layer, its own layer. We'll call that inflate. Let's turn off that hosel. I don't want to see it. I want to add the hosel spline to the hosel. Let's get out of the way. Let's turn the blackout off too, and make sure inflate is in its proper layer. I'm going to create a new material. You know what, first let's do something else. Let's remove this material. I want to show you how we're going to make this a little bit bigger, but we need to do a few things first. Let's go to Sculpt with our inflate geometry selected, brushes, inflate. And now we have a new brush, and if I just drag that across the surface, you can see that it's starting to sculpt or inflate that geometry, which is cool. Not doing the right thing that we want it to do, but if we come down here to our inflate attributes and where it says flood and interactive flood, if I just scale this up or down, you can see that it starts to scale that geometry evenly across its entire surface. So I know that the number 3 worked very well for me. I'm going to show you how much bigger I just made it with just a couple of clicks. Let's go to layers. I'm going to turn the blackout back on. Under inflate, let's go to my attributes and X-ray. And you can see now that we just have that piece of geometry that is evenly spaced across the entire surface. So that's looking pretty cool. Now we need to render this out. I'm going to turn my blackout geometry off, and I'm going to go into my camera, and let's create a new material. We're going to create a sketch material. Drag that onto the surface of the inflate, and I'm going to go to my render settings and set a couple of things up real quick. Change these to 1920 1080. That just works. Under Sketch and Tune Shading, let's change our background color to black. Again, I always render on black for this type of work. Under Object Shading, let's change that to Custom Color. And this is going to affect the geometry inside here. So I'm going to make that a grayish color, and you'll see why here when I render this out. Under my sketch material, I'm going to change the color to white, and let's do a quick render. And you'll see that we now have a black background, and we have these edges that are just gently highlighted. You can start to see the club name, the name of the company, these edges. So this is starting to work pretty well. Now that I have my hosel edge, my inflate, let's take all of those render passes into After Effects and show you how we put them together. Drag those in. I'm going to make them all screen. And once again, let's grab tint and put that on the inflation. Let's change the color to the tailor-made green. It's looking pretty cool, and we'll copy and paste that onto the spline and to the hosel. And I want to make a few adjustments here. So let's turn the transparency of the inflation guy down a little bit. Let's turn the hosel transparency down a little bit too. Now we can see that we're starting to get this nice highlight around that edge of the hosel spline. I'm going to change this spline to white just to give it a little bit of variation. So now we're actually highlighting the hosel, and we have this nice graphic overlay. Let's take a look at that spot one more time and see how it all fits together.
The new M2 irons feature M's distance and height. now with face slots, which means you'll not only reach the green, you'll stay there.
Okay, one more project. Let's do this. The final project I worked on was for WeAreRoyale out of Los Angeles for their client Nasdaq. WeAreRoyale brought me on specifically to do some style frames. They had done a ton of work up front using C4D, rendering some stuff with Octane, but they needed me to come on to help them visualize the data, just to take this world that they had created a little bit further. So let's take a look at the spot, and then I'll show you what I did.
The classic number 2. To most, just a simple pencil. To us, it's blockchain being used to securely track lumber shipments. It's machine intelligence, finding opportunity in unstructured shipping data. It's tomorrow's trading patterns for today's competitive commodity bidding. It's what makes markets great, simpler, and more accessible than ever. That's some pencil. With innovation, technology, and expertise, no one sees markets better than Nasdaq. Nasdaq, rewrite tomorrow.
Okay, so let's talk about what I did for this. They had done a lot of work. Again, I did not do the animation on this. So you could see that we have this really beautiful world rendered out with all of these data bits, highlighting the ship's path, highlighting the ships themselves, all kinds of stuff. So all of this work, a lot of this work was based on some style frames I did for them very early on in this project. So let me show you what I got and what I did. So on the left here is the original image that I got from WeAreRoyale. The pencil breaks apart, and we have this cargo ship made out of wood. We have the ocean made out of graphite. The cargo containers are made out of rubber. We have this really beautiful backdrop of the cityscape with the sailboat. So what I did was on the right. So I had to take that frame and I had to implement some ideas. So how are the ships guided? They're guided by these beacons of light. So we have these horizontal lines here that have these little pink highlights, these horizontal data bits. We have some stuff going on in the background. So that is what I gave to them amongst maybe like 3 or 4 or 5 other frames to guide them on each little aspect of the project that they wanted to talk about, have me show them what to do. So let's get into the scene that I got from them. So I don't use Octane all the time, but they used Octane on this project, and I use Arnold a lot more, so I had to figure out how to do all this stuff in Arnold and then marry it to their Octane renders, but then I had to redo it to show you guys how to do it directly within Cinema. So here we go. So this is what I got with from WeAreRoyale. So they have this really pretty shot. We have all these cargo ships. We have this skyline in the background, the sailboat. So let's just turn a few things off because I'm going to focus my attention on this ship and maybe a little bit on this ship. So let's turn the camera off. Let's turn off the Ship 3 Geo, the sailboat, the city, the ocean. I want it to all go away. So originally when I had made this, I made all of this in X Particles. I use it a lot. I love it. But I wanted to show you how to use some of the new R20 node materials to recreate this. I'm going to show you a problem that I got originally and how I solved that. So a lot of times you can grab the edges of some of this geo, you could go to edge to spline, and then you could render that spline out, and then you've got a wireframe. Very cool, but this ship was a mess. I mean, the geo is a disaster. So how do you fix it? I'll show you how to fix it. You create a material and you fix it. So let's go to new node material, and I'm going to keep myself organized, and I'm going to duplicate this original ship, and I'm going to call this wireframe. I'm going to select that name. I'm going to copy that name, create a new layer, and I'm going to paste that name. So now my object and my layer are all the same thing. Make sure that it's all there. We're staying organized. So let's drag this up under my original geo. And I'm going to do the same thing for the containers. I'm going to call this guy wireframe, copy the name, create a new layer, put that in there, make sure it's in the layer. Cool. So let's turn off the original Ship 1 geo. I don't want to see that anymore. And I also want to turn off the original containers geo. I don't want to see that. So we have our new node material that we created. Let's drag that onto the wireframe, and I'm going to command drag that and put that on the containers wireframe as well. Under attributes, let's select both of those material tags, go to projection, and we're going to turn this to cubic, and we'll double click the node material. It brings up our node editor, and let's just move these over a little bit. Where it says assets, let's click. I'm going to type in grid. Bring that grid node into the node editor. Under color, I'm going to drag that under emission and remove the diffuse. Let's make a few adjustments here to this. Let's turn the softness of this grid. We want the lines to be very harsh. Frequency, let's turn this up to 30, 30, and 30. And under thickness, let's make this 0.05. Seems like a good number. And let's click render. See what we got. So that's starting to look pretty cool. Now, I'm not saying it's the exact answer, but in this situation, it's an answer. It's a solution. These are style frames. I'm just giving them the idea, and then they can figure it out later on. I just want to make the cool stuff and then move on. So we've got that working pretty well. I think that looks nice. You could make some adjustments to it, make the lines thinner, but I think this is working well. Let's duplicate this wireframe cargo ship. I'm going to call this one data. I'm going to duplicate the wireframe containers and call this data. Don't forget to select the name, create a new layer, drag that on there. Make sure these are all the same. It's all about organization. And drag these under their parent. Something like that, that works. So let's turn the wireframe ship off. We don't want that. And turn the containers wireframe off too. So now we just have our data for the ship and the containers. Let's go to create, and we're going to make a new node material. Let's just drag that onto the data geo for the ship and the data for the the data containers. We'll double click. So again, this would be an instance where I used X particles. But there's this very cool tool in here called scatter. And we are going to take that scatter node, and we are going to take its mask and attach it to emission. And we're going to delete the diffuse. We don't need it. You can start to see our material. It has lots of random squares in here, but I want these to be circles. So let's type circle. Bring that guy in. Under result, let's put that under shape. And now we have these circles that are being generated by the scatter, which is then on the surface of our object. Let's make a few adjustments to the scatter. Under the splat, let's make them 2,000 splats. Under scale, let's make this 0.008. Make them really small. And under random scale, let's make this 0.001. Super fine. And let's click render. And we're starting to get somewhere. So again, you take this into After Effects and you start to add some colors to it, start to layer it up on top of itself. You start to get those little bits of data, add some glows. It's looking pretty good. So the next thing I want to do is create these horizontal lines with these little data bits. And this is super fast as well. I am going to duplicate this ship1 geo data, and I am going to call this blackout. And again, add it to its own layer. This might be overkill, but it helps me stay very organized, especially when you're trying to work really quickly for your client. And we will do that to the containers. Call that blackout as well. Copy the name, add it to its own layer. Make sure they're all the same. A lot easier. Okay, so we will turn off the data and leave on the blackout for the geo and the containers. Let's create a new material, and we're going to drag that onto the ship1 geo blackout and the ship1. I didn't name this properly. Let's do that. Okay, so let's call this, let's make this black. Turn off the reflectance. Let's go to black. If I click render, nothing's going to render, which is just what we want. I'm going to go to the top-down view, and I'm going to grab my polygon pen tool. I'm going to click once. Make sure that nothing's selected. That's a key. Polygon pen tool, click once, click twice, and I will duplicate that guy, and I'm going to move it to the other side of the ship. I'll select both of them and drag them up. I just want them to be somewhat under the edge of the deck of the ship. I might move them forward in space just so you don't see the back end, you don't see the front end, so now we just have this nice even space. I'm going to go to Objects, Connect to Object, plus Delete, and I'm going to call this Horizontal. I'm going to create a new spline that is a vertical. I'm going to click once, and I just want it to sort of meet the bottom of that original horizontal. Click twice, so now we have this one guy. I'll call this verticals with that selected. Option, MoGraph, cloner. It is now being cloned, and we want to clone it onto these horizontals. So we'll change the mode to object and put our object horizontal in there. And now we're starting to get these guys generating vertically from our horizontals. So let's increase the number to maybe 30. Let's increase the offset and the offset variation a little bit. And let's adjust our transform to, let's just take this down on the y-axis so that it just looks like it's coming off the surface of the water and this horizontal is hitting its edge. Let's make some data bits that exist on those splines. Create a sphere. Let's make that radius of, let's just say 2. It's a little bigger than I would probably work with, but that's okay right now. With that selected, let's go Option, MoGraph, Cloner, and I'm going to call this Data Horizontal. Again, I like to name everything. And we're going to go to Object, for the cloner, change that to object, and let's drag that onto the horizontals. Let's increase the number to 40. That seems pretty good. Let's adjust the offset variation. And then I'm going to actually collapse these vertical splines here. I just want to make this one object. It makes it a lot easier to work with. Connect objects plus delete. Let's rename it. And let's duplicate our data horizontal. We'll call this data vertical, and we will drag in our vertical spline or object, and we're going to start generating some clones on those vertical lines. Let's take the count down to 20. That seems a little bit better to me. So that's all looking pretty good. The other thing I want to do is I want to randomize the scale of each of these particles so that they're not all the same size. Let's make it a little bit more organic. With both of those clones selected, go to MoGraph and adjust the randomness. By default, the parameter is set to position. Let's affect the scale. We'll go to uniform scale, and we will do minus 0.4. That seems pretty good. I'm going to turn the scale down of these spheres. They're just a little bit big. Let's just make them 1. All right, so let's talk about how to render this out real quick. We're going to go to create, and we're going to do the hair material trick because that guy works really well. We'll put that on the horizontal. I'm not going to put it on the vertical. I've gone through a lot of back and forth with the client. They don't want to see the vertical splines. They just want little bits of data, so we're not going to do that. Let's double-click the material texture tag, and under basic, turn off specular under color. Once again, we don't need that left knot. Double-click the right knot, make it white. And under thickness, let's make this 0.4. You could do whatever you wanted to. If it needed to be thicker, no problem. Let's create a new material, and we're going to do a luminance on the data bits. You could either do it on the spheres or the clones themselves. Doesn't really matter. Let's double-click, basic, luminance on, color reflectance off, and transparency on, and let's make it not that transparent, just a little bit transparent. Do a really quick render here, and you can see that we're going to start getting some things happening. We have a problem though. Our spline, our horizontal is not rendering properly. Very easy fix. Go to our horizontal. Under object, type Bezier, good. Intermediate points, natural. And we'll change that to 65. I'll click render one more time. Starting to look pretty good. Again, you could change the size of these, but just maybe for right now, I'll leave them big just so we can see what's going on. So I've got my scene built. So that's all looking pretty good. The problem that I now have to figure out is depth of field. So I've got to figure that out. I've been working with Arnold, but I don't want to do that now. I got to change things up for the client. So I'm going to use the physical renderer super fast. So let's add that blackout material. So this is my ship to geo down here in the corner. So I'm just going to add my blackout material to that. I'm just making a style frame. I'm not going to put it in its own layer. I think we're all good. And I'm going to go to my render settings, and I'm going to change the renderer to physical. Under physical, just make sure the depth of field is turned on. Just for sake of speed right now, we'll leave the sampler set at adaptive and low. And then we'll make sure that we go into our camera, go to physical, make sure that the movie camera is turned on, and we want a serious amount of depth of field, so let's make our f-stop, our shutter speed 1.6. Do a very quick render here. And now we're starting to get that depth of field. That's looking pretty good. Let's talk about how to composite that together real quick. This one has the most layers in it. So put those all in the same layer, go to screen on the transfer mode, and now look at what we got. That's looking pretty cool. I'm going to add tint to all of these guys again. Let's just make it kind of a blue. That seems fine. And let's do that to everything except for the foundation. So that's looking pretty cool. The one thing I might actually do is on this guide data, let's make these pink. Let's make these a different color. I don't want them to blend in too much. I want them to be a little bit different. So that's looking pretty cool. The other thing that you could do, again, this is just a style frame, so I don't have to be too perfect here. So I'm just going to create a quick garbage mat and block out this area. We can go back and fix it. Once the client approves it, it's like, yeah, that's cool. And you start to refine it. So let's just do this real quick, just for sake of argument. And change its mode to subtract. And that's looking pretty cool. So again, when you have all of the layers, you start to mash them up. It's like layers of a cake. You could start to add the glows, all the little bits and pieces. It's going to start to look pretty cool. Let's take a look at that spot one more time and see how we got there.
The classic number 2. To most, just a simple pencil. To us, it's blockchain being used to securely track lumber shipments. It's machine intelligence, finding opportunity in unstructured shipping data. It's tomorrow's trading patterns for today's competitive commodity bidding. It's what makes markets great, simpler, and more accessible than ever. That's some pencil. With innovation, technology, and expertise, no one sees markets better than Nasdaq. Nasdaq, rewrite tomorrow.
All right, so that does it. I am done for the day. Thank you guys all for your time. My name, again, is Bryan Coleman. You can check me out on my website at bryancoleman.com, on Instagram, Bryan the Coleman, or on Twitter, Bryan the Coleman as well. Thank you, guys.